Welcome to episode 302 of F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen with your host, Matt Payne. This week, I had the utmost pleasure of hosting two fabulous United Kingdom photographers, Joe Cornish and Alex Nail. Alex asked me if he could interview Joe for our Artist Asking Artists series, and I was beyond thrilled at the suggestion. Joe is an inspiration to so many landscape photographers, so it was a true pleasure hearing him answer our tough questions. We covered a huge array of subjects this week, and I think there's something for everyone, so stay tuned. Before we dive in, I wanted to thank those of you who answered my calls for support for the podcast on Patreon. We operate under the value for value model here on the podcast, and I believe that if someone creates something of value that you find value in, you should reciprocate in a show of value as well. As long as it's more than $0, I think it's totally fair. If you too have been meaning to support the show, hit pause and go to patreon.com/fstop and listen and show us how much you value the show. Thank you to those of you that already have. Okay, let's get to this week's episode with Joe Cornish and Alex Nail. All right. I am so happy to have Alex Nail and Joe Cornish here for our fifth iteration of the Artists Asking Artists series of the podcast. And I just wanted to thank you both for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
No problem.
Great. And let's just get some introductions out of the way. Alex. All right. I am so happy to have Alex Nail and Joe. You're no stranger to the podcast, but maybe you can go first.
So I call myself a mountain photographer, a bit of a made-up title. Do a lot of shooting in Scotland, particularly Fisherfield at the moment, and in the Drakensberg in Iceland. I don't suppose I have anything more to add than that, other than my interest in this podcast is in interviewing Joe, who's been an inspiration to me pretty much since I started photography. And so that's how we've ended up here.
Yeah, and it's probably worth noting that every time I talk to photographers from the United Kingdom, Joe is one of the first people that they say is one of their idols. So no pressure.
Well, Alex, thank you. Thank you. And Matt, thank you. I definitely don't feel worthy of any of those. Whatever. So, first of all, I'm a working photographer of 40 plus years. And in terms of landscape, I'd probably describe myself as a general practitioner. So I love doing everything. And I don't feel restriction. I love doing mountains, but I also enjoy being by the sea and doing intimate landscapes. I even do urban landscapes as well. So, just a mad, keen photographer, a guy who loves taking pictures, nothing more than that, really.
Love it. Well, we have prepared a whole litany of really difficult questions for you, Joe. So we're just going to launch right into it, and I'm going to have Alex kick us off.
Yeah, so a bit of a big one to start off, because I've always regarded your photography as relatively complex, Joe. And so I'm wondering what balance you think there is, what role simplicity, complexity, and perfection play, obviously kind of contrasting ideas in landscape photography, and what's most important to you.
Thanks a lot. I think I could probably fill an hour and a half answering this question, so I'll do my best not to. So I think this is a really fascinating question for a number of reasons. So some of them are personal, some are philosophical, some are obviously aesthetic. I was thinking about it earlier today, and cynically, I might say the reason I love making complex pictures is they're a lot more forgiving. It's easier to kind of have a kind of untidy approach, and it allows you to be freer visually. I mean, I personally think that the world is complex, that nature is especially complex. In fact, it's often very chaotic. And in a sense, the aesthetic challenge that all landscape photographers face is trying to answer the question of how much are we recording the world and how much are we interpreting it? Because I think if you literally just recorded as a geographer, you would end up with a lot of very untidy and quote unquote messy photographs, and they might not be very aesthetically pleasing. So I'm very conscious of the fact that it's vital to make pictures that can engage the viewer, and most importantly, engage you, the photographer, so you feel excited about what you're doing. Philosophically, I think that drives the process underneath. It may be unseen, but for me, because of my, if you look at nature and how we've not even touched the surface of how complicated everything works together, everything's interconnected on this planet and in the universe, and to simplify, while that appears to be an aesthetic virtue, I think sometimes it can deny the reality of how the world really is. So for me, do
you think it's possible to carry through that complexity in your images to suggest those complex connections?
I have to believe that. If it isn't, then my entire life is a complete failure as a photographer. So I do think so. I mean, I suppose one thing I would say is, I think you use the word connection, Alex, but connect is the vital kind of glue, literally, metaphorically, for me in photography, in the way I compose things. I do try to build connections. Often there can be connections between very disparate elements within the scene. But fundamentally, what I think of my composition is an attempt, and it is only an attempt, to solve the infinite jigsaw puzzle of form and space. And it is very much about form. If you don't reveal something about form in an innovative or personal way, then essentially photography is not really making any progress. So I think Robert Adams it was who actually made that point in one of his essays, that form is fundamental part of the photographer's personal signature. So I see each photograph as an abstraction. It can be analyzed as such. Something where the relationships within have to work together. And because I believe in complexity, I'm also fighting often between these apparently conflicting issues. Most of my pictures, I suppose, work this way. And since you did very kindly send me this question a couple of weeks ago, I've been thinking about it as I've been going along, and it's really brought it home to me, actually, how meaningful it is for me to have to try to present the world as both comprehensible but also mysterious and complex, and that complexity is part of it.
One of the interesting things I'll just add about your style, Joe, since we're talking about complexity, is I was chatting with Andrew Mann, who's a mutual friend of ours, and he mentioned that what you tend to do, and I think a few others have said this before, is add an extra layer. Where others are trying to simplify, you'll take a step back and bring in another element, which I think is a very unusual approach, particularly in modern landscape photography.
Yeah, that may be true. I mean, in a funny kind of way. I mean, Matt may be able to identify with this, because I'm sure you're familiar with your predecessors in the States. But David Munch would be one of my early exemplars in color photography, and he used quite complex compositions frequently, which you in a very simplistic way, we could say foreground, middle ground, background. But there's a very strong attempt in David's best pictures to connect elements together, and I think that was a form of inspiration. I don't think I perhaps articulated it as that at the time, but you're a sponge as a photographer, aren't you? You absorb influences from all over, and ultimately what you want to do is develop your own voice. And so, I borrowed loads of ideas from David. I borrowed from Peter Dombrovskis, the great Tasmanian photographer, borrowed from Ansel probably. But at the same time, I was also influenced by Edward Weston, who is the classic example of somebody who's able to simplify elements and distill them into something, by the simplicity, so made them even more mysterious than they actually were. I'm not quite sure how he did that, but so yeah, I'm still finding my way, but for me, that at the moment at least, I will say that the idea that the world is complex is is fundamental to how I want to see the world, and therefore I'm happy to embrace complexity.
You've talked a lot about kind of conceptual side of things, but I'm curious if do you have a concrete example of like in the field, what are some ways in which elements can work together?
Yeah, very simply.
Like,
I mean, let's take a simple example. If you had if you were beside a lake and you were looking across to a distant mountain, relatively distant, the mountain has a certain shape depending on the geology of the area, and I'm typically finding myself drawn to elements in the foreground that have some relationship. They may have only a visual relationship. So on the face of it, let's say it's reeds, and one of them is curved in a way that echoes the shape of the mountain. Now it might be on the same parallel, or it might be the inverse. But either way, you can set up a relationship by having those elements be the same proportion in the frame. And that immediately creates a rhythm or a rhyme, a visual rhyme. And then perhaps there's other elements, it might be rocks, it might be an area of moss, or perhaps in the immediate foreground, or on a rock in the background, or that has a textural relationship where again there's a link. It might be a color link. It might be a total contrast. But all the time I'm looking at relationships, trying to find something that will make the connection. And there's another philosophical, and this is, sorry to go back to conceptual element here, but I really, really want to emphasize that everything matters. Every tiny thing in this world matters, and we neglect it at our peril. And so honoring these small, apparently insignificant details, such as reeds or I don't know, spiders' webs, raindrops, anything that has a delicacy and a kind of minimal element that has, to me, evokes a feeling of beauty and connection, are fundamental to building a language of respect and love for the beauty of the world. And those elements are often neglected, and are certainly neglected by the general public, who tend to just tread all over them, literally and metaphorically. So I guess you could say, it could be a kind of protest against that, or it could be in a genuine attempt to try to encourage others to see that beauty as well. But I think for me, they are every bit as important in their own way as the mountain.
Well, that was like a 3-minute masterclass on composition. So thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, so I guess you've sort of segued into this, and we've moved back onto the main theme. But I'm interested as to what you think of the recent trend in photography to move into more intimate styles, and maybe more simplistic, more graphic styles, and what importance you place in the kind of grand scenic photography that I associate you with.
Yeah, well, that's also a fascinating question, and I sense that there must be a personal interest in that, because you love mountains and photograph them brilliantly, by the way.
It's a hugely biased.
Well, fair enough, but my feeling is that it all matters. So I don't dissociate the intimate landscape, or indeed the fact that there may appear to be a trend towards photographing intimate landscapes. I think, by the way, culturally, the reason for that is that more and more people take an interest in landscape photography. So inevitably, they realize that if they want to make a personal statement, it's much harder to do that with a mighty subject. And to quote the classic example, you try standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon and making a really personal image of it. You can record its beauty, and if you're lucky with the light, you can do something highly spectacular, because it is such a spectacular place. But you certainly can't improve it, and it's very difficult to make a personal picture of it, because it already has so much cultural baggage and currency within our world, because it's a global icon of landscape. If you take a little detail from a backwash of a river, or in the edge of a cave, or in an undercliff, or anything like that, where there's something kind of wonderful going on in nature, it's much easier to make a kind of personal interpretation of it, because you're not carrying any baggage with it. And I think that's one of the reasons that people who are kind of very more creatively focused will inevitably find themselves embracing such subject matter. But I personally don't see why you can't use those same skills together, and to try to find ways of keeping that, preserving that connection with the bigger space, the vista, as it's sometimes slightly pejoratively called, because I believe that all human beings are still inspired by space. The idea of the adventure and the feeling of the great possibility of the landscape, and how it inspires our imagination. I certainly think for young people that's really important.
That was fantastic. I mean, that's probably the best explanation of that particular conundrum that I've heard anyone give. We debate that particular subject quite a bit in this field. Along those same lines, Joe, we've seen a dramatic shift in landscape photography from kind of the more traditional style that you helped to develop into a more kind of fantastical, heavily edited style. And I'm curious for you, how has that shift left you feeling? And as one of the quote unquote grandfathers of the former, more classical style.
Let's use the term OG.
Original G, yeah, I like it.
Just to confuse Joe. Yeah.
Now you've lost me. I'll accept grandfather. I've been called that a few times. So. Oh dear. Yeah, I did look, by the way, at, I noticed that DP Review had a review of International Landscape Photographer of the Year recently, so I did scroll through those winning pictures, and they really kind of summarized what you're saying very well, Matt, I think. They were really amazing pictures, without a doubt. So here's my take on it, for what it's worth. I'm very liberal as far as believing and tolerant. I think people should do what they want to do and what they love to do. Of course, these amazing pictures that we see, which we know as experienced folk of the landscape, you can't actually see that in reality. That's the difficulty that I have with it. Now, does that mean people shouldn't do it? No, I think it's fine. But I personally have a problem trying to make, well, I've done it myself from time to time, make a picture using a digital filter in order to create a bit more atmosphere or something like that. And when I've overdone it and lost that feeling of authenticity or connection, I've discovered for myself why I still like to shoot what I would regard as eyewitness photography. And that is that, to me, the power of photography lies in its ability for us to suspend our disbelief. In other words, the fact is, when you look at a photo, it's a two-dimensional representation of the world. It's not the world, it's not reality. But it has got the ability to convince you that what you see in the photograph was something that you could have seen if you were there at the time, that you were, if you'd stood with me, next to me, behind me, and this applies to you guys as well as photographers. Any other companion would have seen something very like that. Clearly there will be subtle interpretations that we'd all make, and the way we frame things and so forth. But the fact is that the lens is able to render, a good lens, to render that scene with such a kind of fidelity that we feel connected to it. And it's that sense of connection that matters to me. And that loss of connection then means that the work represents something different. It's a fantasy landscape, which is fine. After all, it's what painters have done a lot of the time. But it's just not what I want to do, because to me it isn't. It's actually losing a part of photography's greatest power, which is a power to convince and to connect.
And I would submit further that that is what differentiates photography as an art form, is that it is connected to an experience or to a moment. And I think when we start to kind of steer in a different path, it no longer is the same art form. That's for me, though.
Yeah, no.
I know Alex could probably talk about this for like 17 hours. So.
Yeah, well, yeah, we've done it too much. That's the thing, isn't it, Matt? It's old hat now. We've ranted too long on this subject, but it's interesting to hear Joe's
It
take
is.
on it. He's much more patient. In fact, he has a bit of a reputation in the UK community for being tolerant of pretty much every approach, which is good to see. That's maybe the wisdom that you develop over time, and we'll probably mellow out too. I don't know.
It may be because I don't do social media.
Maybe that too. Yeah, that's very anger
Well,
inducing.
I'd say you've mellowed out a little over time, Alex.
I've tried. It's a deliberate attempt. Yeah, so Joe, you actually touched on some artistic ideas around composition, echoing shapes in the landscape, and so on. And I thought it'd be interesting to try and have you unpick what creativity is in a photographic context. What is innate and what is really just a learnt design pattern? Because I'm an engineer, so I tend to see my own thought processes quite matter of factly. I don't think, here's this brilliant artist and I'm going to solve this amazing problem creatively because I'm brilliant. That's not the way I view it at all. I draw on past experiences, and some of it comes naturally, but I still think of that as from past experience and maybe design patterns that I've learned from yourself and others. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question there, and it's an incredibly complicated one. I genuinely think that all human beings have a creative talent or ability of some kind. It's just that at school, through our formal education processes, much of which is good, but an awful lot of our creativity tends to be crushed out of us, squeezed out of us as we go through, especially teenage years, where we're expected to conform and to learn rational thinking and so on, all of which is, a lot of which is good, but it's often not well balanced. If you have a particularly strong scientific education, that does prepare you well for a scientific career, a scientific approach. But I wasn't clever enough to be good at science, and that's what I was told literally at school. You're not clever, Cornish. You better do art. So it was really like,
You've never come across as a clever man.
Well, what can I say? All I would do is point to my son or my daughter, for that matter. So obviously it jumped a generation. I just feel that that photography is the ultimate blend of science and art, and I'm not the first person to say that, clearly. And I think that we as artists have so much to learn from science, and also vice versa. So the way of thinking is really, really so similar, and I find it really sad. And I know I've slightly skewed the question here because I'm sort of answering my own question, but there's a schism between the scientific approach, which on the face of it appears to be endless kind of, you have a theory, you explore the evidence, you digest it, you experiment, you set up an experiment, which then other people have to repeat, and eventually you can prove the theory. Whereas, as certainly the way I was taught art, it was like it was very free, and very, very experimental. I did art, went to art college, did a fine art degree, and I think it's almost as if the tutors were determined to prove that they were all kind of arty geniuses. It wasn't method based in any way. But my own personal view, I've got lots of things to be grateful for that art education for. But I genuinely believe if you look at the lives of artists who've been successful, the careers of artists who've been successful, they cover the gamut of approaches, from the most intuitive to the most method driven. And actually, ultimately, a balance of analytical process where you learn from your mistakes and constantly try things until it works, and using your instincts and eventually learning to trust your instincts is the way ultimately that leads you to be a happy artist, or one who finds some degree of fulfillment. Whether you might disagree with thinking of yourself as an artist. Most photographers are quite uncomfortable with it, especially in the UK. But I personally think it's a slightly absurd anxiety, because it doesn't really matter what you think of yourself as, but the process is a creative one to a large extent. What I do think, though, is that the craft side of it, the ability to develop a confidence in your technical approach, gives you the freedom to be intuitive. So, I mean, in my book First Light, which is now over 20 years old, I think I use the Zen maxim, which is to it's something like master technique, then put yourself at the mercy of inspiration. And I still think there's a lot in that, in that if you know your camera, your tripod, and anything else you use really, really well, you can just allow yourself to respond to what you're seeing, and to find solutions relatively quickly. And sometimes, as we know, that's pretty important in landscape photography. So I
have to say, Joe, that's actually more or less how I ended up in photography in many ways, because I always painted and drew when I was younger, and I was more of a technician than a prodigy or anything. But I loved art. But I was often frustrated by my own technical inadequacies, mixing watercolors or whatever it was. And, you make one error and then it's sort of just spoilt because you didn't mean to do that. The intent wasn't there. So photography was a real freedom for me, because I had the confidence, at least as a technical person, that I would be able to master the technique very quickly. And that gave me an enormous creative freedom. The only thing that I could get wrong really was right or wrong was the creativity. So that was kind of how I ended up in photography.
That's really interesting. And actually, I would say that I think painting, and just take watercolor, for example, it's incredibly difficult and it's really technical. It requires a lot of practice and a lot of understanding of how the physical properties of the materials actually work together. And I've got quite a few friends who are painters, and I watched them at work, and they're obviously highly experienced, but the way that they use the materials is extremely technically accurate, precise, considered, even though the marks they may be making appear sometimes quite random. There's a lot of craft in artistic work, and I don't think we should ever underestimate that. I mean, for me, the joy of photography was partly because I felt myself quite a realist type artist, and I was in a college full of abstractors, as it were, and yet abstraction is something I greatly believe in as a way of thinking, at any rate. But also because it's like drawing, but it's really fast, and that's great. I love the speed of it and the way you can respond to what you see, and also the fact that for me, light was something that always inspired me when I was drawing and painting. So being able to depict light is really difficult with a pencil or any kind of artistic instrument, and the camera is so good at doing that so quickly.
So you actually earlier you talked about making mistakes as part of the artistic process and developing your own vision, and I mean, I've mentioned this to you before, but we went for a hike in May of last year out into Fisherfield, and I've guided about 20 or so photographers there now. And I have never seen any of them work anything like as hard as you did when we got to these locations. And there's a couple of things I noticed. One, you were working in light, which I thought wasn't very interesting. So you were obviously drawing on something else. Two, you were shooting compositions which I didn't think were very good, which, I think is possibly part of the process, because of course you then churn out some of my favorite compositions of all time. And finally, you just seem just completely dogged in that approach. I think when we were on one of these hills, you're shooting for something like 3 hours, more or less solidly, just wandering around in a boulder field and grasses and just exploring all of the opportunities. So I just wondered if you could talk about that whole process, your enthusiasm, and what kind of direction that gives you.
Gosh, yeah. I mean, you could say I'm not a very good photographer, so I have to experiment a lot. I think I'd like to think it's because I still have that childlike sense of wonder and just love being outside with my camera. And I don't. I do think I'm very, very lucky. I feel very energized by nature and by being outside, and especially somewhere, where we went. It was amazing. I mean, it wasn't good lighting conditions. I'd be the first to agree with that. But at the same time, it was very easy conditions to work in. It was mild. It wasn't windy. It was pleasant, and I like soft light. And I think that's a big difference. And that's something we'll perhaps come back to later. But I'm always interested in the possibility: can I make a picture work in soft light? Because for me, it's not. It isn't a matter of using intense drama. Those are great when those moments happen, but I have found I mean, if you take my book Scotland's Mountains, which I know you know, Alex, an awful lot of the pictures in there were made in very flat, overcast conditions, or in rain or fog, and for me, they have an intensity and a connection that is part of who I am. So I'd say that it's also part of me. I feel too that I think that so Peter Dombrovskis is a really big inspiration for me. And if you know Peter's work, you'll know that he worked in soft light a lot, and there's a subtle beauty in his pictures. It's very the opposite of bombastic or pompous. It's just very lyrical, and it's very. It's almost as if you're there, but you don't detect the photographer. And in a way, that's my ideal photograph. Is one where the photographer's influence has disappeared. It's as if you're looking through a window onto beauty, but you don't find yourself thinking about how clever the photographer is for being there at such and such a moment. Or it's the opposite of ego, really. And you're more likely to be able to make pictures like that, I think, in very in light that doesn't force itself on the viewer. There's a famous, Paul Wakefield. I'm not sure if you've met him, but I know Paul quite well. I mean, he has a great quote, which is very specific to him, I should say, not to me, but it's one I remember, and I still think of often. He says, "Strong light breaks my composition." And that's a really clever and interesting statement, because you connect strong with break. And so it's easy to remember it. And when I look at Paul's work, I know what he means. Not everybody likes his work by any means, but I love it. I find it very inspiring. And he generally works in very, very overcast and very gloomy and often stormy conditions, which have a kind of mythic, epic quality, because often the landscapes themselves are very, very grand in his images, but the light is not grand, if that makes sense. I don't know if that helps, but to me, I want to be open to the possibilities of soft light. So, rather like what Eugene Smith said, daylight, artificial light, I'll use any light that's going. And I'm a bit the same, really. So,
Yeah, there's no such thing as bad light.
Exactly.
I mean, one of the things that I think is very different in our approaches is that I tend to look around a scene and assess where the possibility lies, and then look at that possibility and then try to decide whether it's worthwhile photographing and then move on. Whereas you seem to find things interesting, and that was enough to form the basis of an attempt at a photograph. And then maybe you're more willing to fail. I'm not exactly sure what that difference is. It's just you were taking a lot more compositions and trying a lot more ideas.
I am willing to fail, and because I see that as part of the creative process. And I mean, especially someone new. If I were to, I mean, this morning I was out with my camera on our hills at the back, and I know them really, really well. So the way I work is I never want to repeat myself course, you never repeat yourself because it's always different light and so on. I'll always try and come up with a new idea, find a new way of translating what I'm looking at. And the beauty of that is that you're familiar, so you know you have a kind of, you've set yourself quite a high bar perhaps. Whereas in Fisherfield, I was at ground zero in terms of where I was coming from. I hadn't been in there before. I had once, but with some friends. It wasn't really a photo trip. So, and you know, I packed in the big camera, which I love using for very detailed compositions. Because that's what it's really good at. So I was more than happy just to be there and to try things. And I'm sorry if I held you up.
Oh no, yeah, you definitely didn't. Yeah, Joe's a very good hiker. I can tell everybody that, especially yeah, given you're 60 something, aren't you, Joe? And you're out hiking. Yeah, many people younger than you, I'm sure. You're one of these guys who annoyingly floats up the hills whilst the rest of us battle up them. But yeah, there you go.
I wish. Well, I'm still trying to stay as able to do that as I want. I was thinking about this earlier. You know, one thing I definitely don't want to die with the tank half full. I want to be, it needs to be empty.
I love it.
So, I mean, actually, that's a really good segue into asking, you know, do you have any short and medium term goals for your work? Are you still ambitious with what you're trying to achieve? Do you have projects?
Well, I had two huge projects this year actually. So I'm kind of trying to empty my mind a little bit from those, so I can refocus perhaps on. I mean, you and I have discussed a book idea, which I'd still like to do. But I keep thinking, well, maybe it's a series of smaller books or something. And, you know, not really. I think at the moment, my motivation is still to just be out with my camera and to enjoy that as much as I can. And I know I don't do social media, so I don't really appear to be very sharing or community based. But I just don't feel that that's me doing social media. I'm not sure if it's because I'm too old or whether I want to help. I really do, but I'm not quite sure. I'm still not quite sure how we photographers can really do that. And so for now, perhaps the most important thing is to try to identify, you know, the beauty that there still is while we can.
Maybe that's a good segue for one of my questions. From your perspective, can landscape photographers serve the global community beyond our own interests? And if so, what is our contribution?
Yeah, I think that we can definitely we can contribute, but it's extremely complex and I don't think it's about any individual, but of course inevitably you do end up pointing out certain individuals, you know, yourselves included, and Matt, you know, the work that you've done with Nature First, which I think is great. I'm not quite sure where, you know, how much progress that's made, but I just think the fact of any group of individuals getting together to identify these issues, bring it to the public domain, and to try to encourage other people to uphold the highest standards of behavior when they're out in nature and inspire others is a very, very positive thing to do. So that's one thing. You could point at photographers who have been more in the realm of photojournalism and doing things like Garth Lens in Canada with his tar sands work, which is, you know, been incredibly dangerous for him and frightening and inspiring at the same time, you know, to study that work, or Edward Bertinsky, another Canadian who's you know, his work has achieved worldwide public renown, and it's very much, especially now, I'd say very protest based, and so these are more kind of classical journalistic functions for landscape photography. But clearly most of us, landscape photography is a form of retreat and joy and and a way of connecting with nature, which is, I suppose, in a way, allows us to utilize skills that are very much those of our hunter-gathering ancestors in some ways, and I think that helps us. It helps us to feel connected with nature and to feel motivated to want to change, whether it's our own behavior or those of our communities or those that we can influence if we can. But it's all very, very difficult because the politics of it are so complicated. And, what it would be really good is if we were able to contribute, which I know some of us already do, work to environmental charities who are trying to make progress in these fields. But even that is complicated because not all environmental charities are as good as they claim to be, and so on. So, we have to be careful with those associations. Also, wouldn't it be nice if the landscape photography community was able, as you have really tried to pioneer, I think, Matt, codes of behavior and to have positive net influence on society if we could. But you very quickly get accused of preaching and so on. So it's a tough one.
Yeah, that's the hardest part about it is you end up getting people that don't appreciate it, or they don't want to be told what they can and can't do, which is not really the whole purpose of those types of initiatives. It's really just to start a conversation and get people to just be more mindful about their own behavior. That's really it. And yeah, I've been on the receiving end of a lot of hateful statements from people in our community about, like, oh, you're just trying to tell me what I can and can't do. And it's like, you completely missed the point. But yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, it is hard. I think that especially online, that's a risk, isn't it? Whereas I guess, for me, most of the contact I have with other photographers is on workshops. And sometimes it's a completely new group. I do charitable workshops and so on. Sometimes it's people I know really well who keep coming back for more on tours and so on, which is lovely. And they develop a kind of shared, we develop as groups a kind of shared ethos of things that we love to do and what we believe, and we get to know each other and share our kind of collective values that way. I'm not saying that everybody thinks the same as me, and I wouldn't want that, but I think all of that helps a little bit. And clearly when you're face to face, people are much less likely to be hostile. I think it's inevitable,
right?
That, because you have a personal connection there, and you're much more likely to want to develop hopefully a conversation that has a good outcome. Whereas, I don't know, online, it does feel like a bit of a war zone sometimes.
Totally. Kind of along those same lines, maybe this is a good segue for one of my other questions, Alex. Joe, you recently wrote just a wonderful article for On Landscape about the disappearing Arctic, through which you laid out your own personal internal struggles with climate change and travel. As we were talking before this podcast started, I just returned from a trip from Antarctica myself. It's very top of mind for me in terms of like what is my carbon footprint, and should I be taking more trips like that? And if so, like, how do you reconcile that? I have a lot of cognitive dissonance going on for myself. So I'm curious, and from your perspective as photographers, how do we reconcile this?
The answer is I just don't know. And I say that I by the way, I at various times in the 2000s, I tried to stop flying. This is before it was a thing. I didn't stop completely, but I largely didn't. This is when I was doing the work mainly in Scotland, which Alex knows, and that. Yeah, I really by about 2010, I thought I just denied myself tons of wonderful opportunities, and then I had an opportunity to go to Antarctica, and I just felt like, well, I've been wearing the hair shirt all this time and hasn't really got me anywhere, and I haven't changed anything. And Antarctica, for all sorts of reasons, the narrative of Shackleton and Scott and the kind of cultural figures in the UK at any rate, had always had me very interested in visiting there, and And by the way, I've been in love with the idea of photographing icebergs since 1983 or something, when I first saw Elliot Porter's pictures of icebergs in his book on Antarctica. So anyway, I've been 3 times is the answer, but I'm not going to return now, because I have accepted that I can't justify going again. 3 times ought to be enough. I think for somebody like me, I can't really argue that what I do can change the world for the better as a result of going. And so having been, and I have a great personal feeling connection with Antarctica as a result of those trips, and an appreciation for the wonder that it is, and a great strong desire to hope that it will remain, as intact as possible for future, not just for future generations, but for the sake of the planet generally. And yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's one of a number of questions that we have to ask ourselves. So, but I will also say that I've made a living out of traveling to a large extent. That's where I've done most of my photography. When I was a young photographer, I was really more of a general travel photographer than a landscape photographer. I was incredibly lucky to travel, went to wonderful countries, met loads of people, learned kind of cultural differences, and hopefully as a human being, I've developed a bit more empathy and understanding than I would have done. And I still think that travel can be a very enriching experience, especially for younger people, and that it's important to travel. So there are lower carbon footprint methods of traveling, train obviously, particularly, horseback, bicycle, and in the UK we have the option of going to most of Europe relatively easily on the train, and using other methods. But I did, just to give you an idea. So my son Sam, who Alex knows, had an amazing experience in the Arctic a few years ago, and he had to get to Tromsø for the beginning of the voyage, and he went by train from Oxford, which took 3.5 days. But he decided that was the right thing to do rather than flying, which would have cost about 1/10 as much. But because he wanted to try to do the right thing. So, I found that in itself was quite an inspiring thought. And all of his fellow students who were involved in that expedition did the same, wherever they came from. Except those from the Far East, but anyway, all the European ones. So, I think the younger generation of young leaders and scientists are already very much trying to live how they believe. In a way, it's really for my generation to feel thoroughly guilty and to try to do less. But I have one more thought, and obviously having Alex there is quite good, being an aircraft engineer. So air travel is not going to go away. I don't think. I'm very conscious of the fact you can't really seriously expect us all to stop traveling. I think what we have to do is to face up to our carbon obligations. So personally, I would like to see frequent travel being taxed, so that there is an association with frequent flying. After all, it's those who can fly frequently can probably afford to pay a tax that should then be used, maybe whether it's nationally or locally or collectively internationally, as a way of providing mitigating technologies or developing air travel that is more environmentally acceptable. And I've heard of numerous innovations that are coming, and the potential for hydrogen, if it was green hydrogen, obviously not blue hydrogen, as a fuel, and so on. So there is potential for much lower, maybe not zero carbon footprint travel, but lower carbon footprint air travel in the future. And I think we obviously have to be able to fund that, and that funding is partly going to come from people still flying. Otherwise, what's the incentive? So that's the conundrum. And I don't know. I mean, I have moments of feeling very, very gloomy about it, and other days when I feel much more hopeful. But I think we can't stop traveling completely. And by the way, Matt, in your case, I completely relate to you wanting to go to Antarctica. I mean, who wouldn't? Who loves nature? And did you get some good iceberg pictures?
Amazing.
There
It's
you go.
just incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's really unlike any other place on the planet. I mean the wildlife opportunities are incredible as well. I mean the wildlife's been so protected there so they don't have any fear of humans and they'll just walk right up to you, you know? It's fascinating.
It really, really is. Yeah, it's yeah. I mean, you could you could say to anybody who's a keen photographer that if you could guilt free go anywhere in the world, where would you go? Antarctica would definitely be in that top 5 or 3 or whatever. Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to drag you both into photography again, I think, because I've got more questions for you, Joe. Because I just know that having spent some time talking to you, that you've just developed a lot of ideas over your career that do take a lot of time to develop. So I'm going to drag you back to talking about light, and I'm going to start by quoting your book. First Light, because you've actually written the only line in photography that I've ever managed to memorize, maybe because it makes a lot of sense to me, or it certainly did at the time. And it's the first line of First Light, which is first light, everything else follows, for light is the language of the landscape as well as its raw material. So I'd be interested firstly to know whether you think that still applies, and secondly, just whether you have any interesting ideas around lighting and lighting setups, little tidbits that people might be able to learn from.
Well, to answer the first part first, it's a good question because it's challenging for me, because I do really believe in the idea of light as being primary. It is fundamental in photography, but I probably my idea about what light is good light for photography, as we sort of touched on earlier, has changed quite a lot since I wrote that book. And I guess if you would go through that book now, you would find the majority of images are quite, well, they're not necessarily hallelujah light, if I can use that expression. A lot of them are quite dramatic, quite strong light. Whereas today, I generally work a lot more with softer light, and have really embraced it much more. But still, fundamentally, the quality of the light really, really matters. You know, it is really, really fundamental. I think there's to try to answer the second question is really difficult. I think I have had a very interesting and fun experience of being out with Colin Pryor the other day with our cameras a few days ago, and Colin's got very strong ideas about how the light needs to be for his type of landscape photography. You know, in a way, he's your kind of predecessor in the mountains, Alex. So I think you'll be able to relate to what I'm talking about. And Colin, so what it made me realize, I don't want to talk about Colin's approach because that's very much for him, but what it made me realize hearing Colin was that my own approach is much more, I'll use the term liberal again. So I kind of think, well, you know, any light, but what you need to be able to do is understand when it will work. And if we go back to the Fisherfield experience that you and I had last year, a number of the pictures that I made, compositionally I thought were good, but didn't really work that well because the lighting didn't bring the landscape to life. And I probably had got so used to shooting in soft light in the last 2 or 3 years because I spent a lot of time in woodland. So in soft light, woodland is a good location, I would say, generally, because it's a very, very high contrast location. So the very first, probably the most important tip, if I could call it that, or guideline, and it should only ever be that because you should always break rules, in my view, photographically, is that if the subject contrast is high, then you're usually better off with lower contrast lighting, and vice versa. And that's still something I usually kind of use as a starting point when we have discussions about light on workshops. Of course, it doesn't always apply, and there's always exceptions, especially when it comes to shooting into the light, for example. But so soft light is great for woodland. So softer the light, the better. Partly because woodland is incredibly, A, it's very complex, and B, it's very high contrast.
This is actually exactly why I asked the question, because I think what you've just said is actually quite obvious to almost everybody listening, I would imagine, and yet having it clarified, distilled into an idea like that is somehow valuable, to have that as an approach to tackle subjects, to select subjects for various lighting. So that's really interesting.
Well, just to put it into perspective, when we do workshops, if I well, I'm on my own, or more usually with David, for example, Ward, we basically go to places that we would go on that day with our groups. So and that's always based on the weather. So let's say we know it's going to be a cloudy start to the day, maybe a bit foggy, no views to see. We go to the woods, and then perhaps the forecast is suggesting it's going to clear out for the afternoon. And then we'd head on up to the moor, onto the into the valley where we had views of the mountains, depending where we are. So that's exactly what we would do if we were on our own with our cameras, and that's what we would always try to do for our workshop groups, because that way you're able to teach the language of light with with practical subject matter, as it were, and usually it proves correct. I think the one thing that perhaps I'd like to add to that is the question of shooting into the light, or with the light behind you, or with the light to one side. In a very crude sense, those are the kind of three obvious. It's what we all have to do. When we would point at our cameras at something, where is the light? I mean, we all think about. Do we think about it? It's so instinctive because we're so familiar with it. But if we are trying to be conscious about it, the way I would describe it is that the sky is your studio. So in terms of the concept, because I worked in a studio as an assistant, so I got very used to using the studio environment as a light source. And especially if you photograph cars, which are essentially a car-shaped mirror, where everything is reflected off the car's exterior, and you have to manage the light in a way to make the car model itself into something that looks three-dimensional using light and shade. So it's a great exercise in light and control. Of course, we don't have those issues because generally not working with quite such reflective surfaces out in nature. But nevertheless, you can still see the sky as like the roof of the studio, and the sun is your single light source. If you start thinking of it like that, you realize that if the sky is blue and there's no clouds, light's going to be very harsh. Why? Because there's relatively little reflected light from the blue sky. There is some blue, because if you look into deep shadows, they're always incredibly blue on days like that. Fortunately, in the UK, we get very few days like that, because they're the hardest, in my opinion, to photograph in the open landscape because of the harshness of the conditions. Very deep shadows, very little light in the shadows. Whereas when there's lots of clouds around, it fills in the shadows because it's both diffused and reflected. And so the clouds behave as diffusers and reflectors. And if the sun is somewhat behind clouds or completely behind clouds, then obviously everything is diffused. But you can still get directions sometimes when there's thin cloud. If it's very thick cloud, it becomes directionless. So all of these are ways of reading the light that helps you understand, why does the landscape look the way that it does? The answer is because the Sky Studio is making it look that way. So modeling the way you look at a three-dimensional object. I mean, that classic example when you're in the art studio as an A-level or a GCSE student or something. If you have your art teacher might show you three different shaped objects: a triangle, a cube, and a sphere, and you have a single light source, and you can manipulate the light and watch the light change on those three objects and how they're modeled. That's essentially a very simplified version of what's happening in the landscape all the time, constantly. Even at night, in fact, where you have obviously a much more extreme kind of subtraction of light, but you still get little light sources, and they're the ones that light up what we do see. or sometimes moonlight, which can be very harsh. But there's no reflected light; it's only the light of the moon.
I had a trip about 3 years ago, a fall color trip here in Colorado, where we literally had 12 straight days of no clouds, just blue skies. And, I actually really value that experience because it forced me to try to get more creative and rely less upon the conditions. And I found myself photographing a lot more in blue hour and photographing a lot more in the shade and,
Exactly.
smaller subjects that didn't necessarily depend on the light necessarily. Curious for you, when you have those days like that, what are some of the things that you do to still remain
Matt,
productive?
Joe also lives in the UK, so let's.
Right, so it's very rare, but
Well, no, it's an interesting question, Matt, because I spent quite a lot of time in the States as well. Lucky me, and which is what the most amazing country for photography, and also sometimes I've done 4 tours in Colorado, which is a fantastic state. So, lucky you. However, I guess my technique for dealing with blue skies has been mostly defined by being in Utah, and the great thing about Utah is all those canyons. So the answer is duck into the canyon and hang out in there, and then you get remarkable effects of reflected light. And it's basically about avoiding the direct sunlight a lot of the time. In the middle of the day, the deeper and steeper the canyon, the more powerful the effects of shadow can be. But yeah, I still, for me, the Narrows of the Virgin River is still one of the great landscape experiences of my life. I've walked up it a couple of times, 3 times I think now. You've probably been up there hundreds of times, or lots of photographers have, but I just find it utterly beguiling, incredible place. I've also been in many smaller slot canyons, and they all offer wonderful, extraordinary light when the light is rubbish, you would say, out on the open plateau, because the sun's high in the sky and there's no clouds to relieve its harshness. So yes, occasionally I've actually used some of those techniques in the UK, in fact, by standing in the shadows and photographing the reflections of sunlit cliffs and blue sky beyond, and they create magic with almost any kind of rock, but especially say limestone, which is relatively neutral, that's revealed in the intertidal zone. That can be just fascinating. There's not that many obvious places where that can be done, but there are a few, and I've had some fun doing that. But that was really specifically a technique I'd say I learned from America and American photographers.
So since you mentioned the color of light, TJ, let's talk a little bit about color, because I've rung you up in the past to discuss blues and greens and printing and my various hang-ups around color. So I thought I'd just ask a very open-ended question there about, give us some of your ideas around colours and greens and blues and all of the thoughts you have on them.
So, it's a really interesting, very tricky one. So for me, digital photography and film photography do part ways here slightly. I used to love shooting almost anything with my film camera and transparency film, and I'd accept the colour pretty much as a film produced it, and didn't really think that much. Well, I did think about it, but I didn't realize I had much control over it. I didn't in practice. Whereas when I did transition to use digital, it took me about 5 years to realize that actually now I was completely responsible for the color. And then the more I got to realize that, the more I also got to realize that, especially with the earlier digital cameras, that the greens were just nothing like the greens I was seeing with my own eyes coming out of the raw files. They were way yellower and much more saturated. And although I think that's possibly improved a little bit in recent years, they're still, for me, the greens don't look like the greens I see with my own eyes. Now, I might be wrong, they might be, but I don't like them anyway. So for me, I have typically, not always, but typically I have a kind of green fix and I don't use a preset, but I have in general terms, if there's a lot of green in a landscape photo, then I'll always edit it separately as a hue. So the hue will be usually cooled off. So I'd say back away from the yellow towards something more aqua, if we use Adobe's language in Lightroom. And I will typically then also desaturate that green globally, not always, but usually globally, and quite often darken it, although occasionally I'll lighten. So, luminance will usually go down a little bit. I don't know if this is sounding familiar. I'm sure a few people will be nodding and some people are thinking, what's wrong with him? But it's just that, to me, the greens just are so eye-poppingly bright in a lot of digital photography. They're just plain distracting. That's not how I see green. And I'm not saying that I'm right, but obviously for my eyes, I'm right. So,
yeah, I mean, I feel the same way. And one of the interesting things was, independently, I was kind of doing a similar thing. I mean, particularly with desaturation, but also with a slight hue shift to get away from that yellow, because those yellow greens can be a bit overpowering. And I've always kind of wondered why that was, whether it is a perception difference. We just think we're seeing less saturated greens, or if it's actually a real difference, and if it's to do with the bi-array having 2 green pixels and only 1 red and 1 blue, or I have no idea really.
Sorry, I'll jump in again, Matt, there, because I can see I'm sure you've got a view on this too, but I guess maybe that the Brits in particular have an issue with green because there's such a lot of it in our landscape, whereas you can avoid it a lot of the time, or at least you're not confronted by it in quite the same way. So I think the Bayer array could be, I mean, I haven't spoken to a color scientist about this, but I do think that the 2 green photosites to each red and blue one is at least partially responsible for the excess greens. And I've never heard anybody contradict that who was on the color side. Maybe there'll come a time when we have a more sophisticated way of interpreting the color. But one thing I've noticed is that the phones do not produce the same problematic. So we take snaps with our phones, and very often the greens look quite natural. So it's as if they've been very cleverly processed. So on the face of it, it looks like the engineers at Apple and Samsung, etc., are of much the same mind, that the greens are too strong. Also, I think that other colors often get lost against that very bright green. And by the way, blue I find can be too strong as well, and sometimes too cyan. So I'll often back that off a little bit. Sometimes I take a slight hue shift towards magenta. That might be because of my Fujichrome biases from the past, possibly, but I genuinely try to have blues that look like the blues that I believe were there or that I remember, and I often desaturate by 10%, let's say, for blues. But it's never a formula. It's always based on what looks right to me for an individual picture. And finally, that often means that in a sort of counterpoint, that oranges and reds might get a little boost to bring them forward a bit as well. I don't want them to look unnatural, but just so that they're able to hold their own more in the photograph.
They're just
sense.
Generally sexier colours, oranges and reds, let's be honest. They're what everybody wants.
You said you're young, I'm not. I can't use a word like that any longer. It's outside my permission zone.
Well, speaking of color, one thing that I've noticed over the years is that there seems to be kind of a specific aesthetic that UK photographers have in comparison to United States-based photographers. And I've always wondered if that was more just because of the subjects that we have here, or if it's more like a preference towards less saturated colors in the United Kingdom. I've noticed a lot of UK photographers, their photos tend to be just less colorful in general, and I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about that.
I do have lots of thoughts about it, and I've actually had to write about it recently because
Oh, good.
I got asked a similar question, and I do feel that there's a great danger that our cultural prejudices could be aired here, because I do know there are some European and British photographers who think American photography is a bit shouty, Matt. So, which is very unfair, because actually the main difference is the landscape itself, in my humble opinion. The American landscape is very rich in color. There's all sorts of geophysical reasons why that's true, but the Colorado Plateau, which, is such a kind of, Yosemite aside, the Colorado Plateau is that when we British and European photographers think of America, we think of Utah and Arizona and Colorado and and so on, and New Mexico, and what incredible landscapes they are. They are very, very rich in color. I mean, Colorado sedimentary rock layers in the Grand Canyon, I mean, just absolutely astounding. And you find numerous canyons equally beautiful, just a little bit smaller elsewhere. And those reds and oranges are just as seductive for us. But clearly, it does create a different kind of color language, I think. And perhaps for Americans, there's a feeling that brightness and brilliance is something that is almost like patriotic duty. Whereas I think Europeans and Brits are probably more culturally.
Say classy, more, Joe. Just say classy.
You can say that, Alex. I wouldn't. I'm too pro-American. I
can't believe this. I feel like you've completely sold us out here. The reason that American landscape photography is more colourful is because the landscape is more colourful.
Oh, he's right.
So here's one thing I will say is, if you have been with me this morning on our modest moorland behind the village and seen the sunrise, then Alex, you make your point very well. Actually, it was phenomenally bright, brilliant pinks and oranges and extraordinary azure blues. So, clearly we have our very colourful moments as well. And often the colour of light is the colour of light. I think geologically, the Colorado Plateau is actually a very bright and richly coloured environment. Whereas you could argue, but here's the thing. So one of the reasons I love Scotland as much as I do is that in the autumn, the colours there are richer than anywhere else, I think, in the UK. And the main reason for that is it's so flipping wet. They're very saturated and very damp, and in central Scotland, where the woodland, the big woods, the big trees are, mixture of coniferous and broadleaf, the colours are really astonishingly beautiful and rich and vivid, and everybody loves that. There's nothing wrong with it. But overall, I think that there's a kind of culture in the UK and in Europe as well of a kind of love of subtlety and not. I mean, I really don't know how to express it, but especially Scandinavian. You think of Scandinavian photographers; they tend to be very, very low key in terms of the way they use color, very knocked back very often. Not to say that they don't use color, but you often see these very monochromatic images, and Norway and Sweden can. They're very wintry countries. They have long winters with a lot of snow and ice and dark rocks, fascinating contrast. The mountains are often covered in snow and ice. And I guess, honestly, I think it's just part of the visual language of being a Northern European in a way.
I love it. What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's more or less it. I think it's sort of like a learned aesthetic to a certain degree. I mean, I was just thinking, can I think of any British painters who have a contrasty, colourful style, and all the ones that come to mind have relatively muted, often very coherent colour palettes. They're not painting dramatic sunsets or anything like that. And then, of course, the States has the Hudson River School, which kind of you could almost say that that's the footprint of, the basis of this visual style to a degree. This sort of backlit into the sunset dramatic effects. And I've always wondered, what the influence of photographers like Galen Rowell might have been on American landscape photography. And I think patriotism does come into play, would be my speculation, because certainly the way Americans seem to regard their own national parks is with a great deal of pride. And I think the visual hallmark of the national parks is these grand scenics in spectacular light to really put across the wonder of these places. And I don't think we have that in the UK. I think there's relatively little recognition of how wonderful our landscape is amongst the general public. And, there's a general reticence to display that wonder on your wall, if you like. There's just some very, very stark differences there going on, that's for sure.
Personally, I'm delighted you mentioned the Hudson River School, because it's an area of a kind of school of painting which I've been really fascinated by, and I've got 2 or 3 books on, and I have all sorts of thoughts about it, not least of which is that some of the Hudson River School painters were influenced by pioneer photographers. Did you know that, Matt? So
I didn't.
Carlton Watkins, to name but one, and actually, oh gosh, I'm trying to remember the. I'm really poor on names. Albert von Bierstadt. He actually used Watkins's compositions as a guide for his Great Pictures of Yosemite. So, he essentially was using Watkins's sense of composition as a kind of template for his own. So Watkins had effectively acted as a scout for him. And in many ways, I think that, Watkins to me is a great forgotten hero of American photography, actually. And which is really, really sad, because I think he's such a kind of extraordinary, unique cultural figure, and he did influence other members of the Hudson River School as well. And by the way, the Hudson River School, which is, so those painters are fantastic painters, Thomas Morans and von Bierstadt and Thomas Cole. They're just the 3 that immediately spring to mind. Brilliant technicians, amazing visionary artists whose work was incredibly unpopular when I was an art student, by the way. But they're coming back into style, into fashion more now, I think. But they all of those 3, and most of them are of European descent. And I have this theory that part of their of the kind of what you might call the flamboyance of their style is because they're trying to prove to their European cousins that America is better than Europe. and there's actually the school of the sublime, because that's what it is, of sublime painting, is a kind of arms race culturally, which declares to Europe that our new world is bigger and better and more colourful than yours, the old world.
So which is better, Joe, Europe or America?
Yeah, I couldn't possibly say.
Well, it is interesting though, because I've had a lot of contemporary landscape photographers as guests on the show that have that more fantastical style, like Ryan Dyer and Mark Adamus, and the list goes on, and they've all referenced the Hudson River School as being an influence on their photography. So I think it makes sense.
Well, it does, and you know what? I mean, I think that it should be not that it's anything to do with me, but I kind of feel that that having a good knowledge of your predecessors in the visual arts is really important to understand that you're not the first person to do. None of us are. We're always building on previous uses of visual ideas and languages. And the Hudson River School painters are absolutely amazing. We might have a disagree with them about some things philosophical and religious and so forth, but what we can feel is inspired by their love of nature and their celebration of the beauty of the world, which I mean is really really evident in their work. And I use that perhaps trying to be quite provocative about the sort of new world's better than the old world, but I think there is genuinely there's always been that kind of rivalry culturally between these across the Atlantic. And in many ways, I feel it myself when I'm in the States. And when I was there last, went to Yosemite, did a workshop with David, and we visited Charlie Kramer afterwards. And the three of us went to Kings Canyon and Sequoia for a few days just to have a bit of fun with our cameras. And I went up onto one of the high passes above Kings Canyon, and we stood there and looked to the north and to the south, and apart from the road we were standing on, you could see absolutely nothing but wilderness in the Sierra Nevada. And I honestly, I can't think of anywhere in Europe where I could be in the high Alps, let's say, or maybe the Carpathians or somewhere like that, or the Pyrenees, any big mountain range where you could look around you and you wouldn't see something that reminded you that you were in an occupied landscape, because everywhere in Europe is occupied. And it's not that it's not beautiful, it is, many parts of it, but the wildness of the US remains a kind of dream for many of us of European descent. To be able to go to and see nature without it having been half ruined. I should say, of course, a lot of the Sierra has been ruined, and has been, well, not ruined, but it's been logged. But there are these preserved areas that remain just incredibly beautiful and amazing, and are really an inheritance for the planet, and they should be, in my humble opinion, should be preserved forever.
Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, the United States has probably the most diverse subject matter in terms of the landscape, but it also has probably just the most sheer amount of it that you can access and be in the wilderness like you're just describing. And I think that also plays a role in why we see American photographers sometimes dominating competitions and things like that, because there's just more opportunity to make amazing photographs here, I think.
I also think that there's a lot of little things in the American landscape where they just have a slightly better, slightly more perfect version of what we might get in Europe. I mean, when I see all these aspen images and like every leaf is just absolutely flawless and symmetrical and unmarked, and the equivalent birch leaf is sort of half rotting away on one side, and you're like, so you have to step back to just like make a general impression of the yellow color, but actually there's a green bit stuck up there, but never mind. And the aspens are just on fire, this whole wall of color and perfection. And all these leaf abstracts, leaves floating on ponds and what have you, and they're just, every leaf is flawless. And yeah. There's lots of that kind of stuff. Or white sands, there's just flawless gypsum sand everywhere. Just crazy.
Sorry.
Yeah. You should be. Not fair. Yeah. No, that's actually just, I know that this is going on, but one last thing, at least from my point of view, I wanted to mention. You actually did mention it very early doors, Alex, and it was about perfection. And I just wanted to make the point that for me, landscape photography is not about perfection. I actually don't think that the art, it would be a kind of, it's almost like it's not the right idea. I genuinely think that life is rich and complex and fascinating, but it isn't perfect. And so trying to create or present a world that looks perfect, to me, doesn't connect with me at all. And that's one of the reasons that perhaps I'm not so keen on that kind of fantasy style of landscape photography that you were talking about earlier, Matt.
Yeah, that's actually one of the most profound ideas I took away from our hike together, Joe, because you basically said that you deliberately embrace imperfection because it gives authenticity to the landscape. And I think that's such an important idea, because I think that clean, simplistic, quote perfect images can be visually really satisfying, but they can also end up feeling quite sterile and impersonal, and actually dissociated from the subject matter. Yeah, so I've actually spoken to a few photographers privately about this, sometimes complimenting them on the flaws that they've included effectively, and other times asking why they felt they needed to remove flaws that I knew were there, because and that's been an interesting part of our competition, actually, hasn't it, Matt? Seeing, some people did break our cloning rules, often in ways that didn't seem to matter, and it seems to be some sort of understanding of the importance of perfection, and that everything should be this idealized view that I don't know, it seems to have gone a little bit too far, maybe.
It was particularly interesting hearing some of the judges talk about it in terms of like pointing out flaws in images, and it's like, oh, with that thing over there, if that wasn't in the frame, it would be a better image. And it's like, yeah, but that would not be a representation of what they actually experienced. And so I think there has been a huge shift towards perfecting photographs, especially over the last decade. And I appreciate it when I see people actually keep imperfections in images and make them work, and use it to their advantage. I think Hans Strand does a pretty good job of that. He has stuff shooting out in the corners. Most people would clone that stuff out or whatever, and it actually helps his composition somehow. So I think
I say, there's beauty in imperfection. I just don't see the problem with it at all. I mean, look at Paul Wakefield's photographs, for example, and Paul would never. I'm certain he would never try to get rid of something because it, wasn't, didn't. I don't know. If it's in the picture, it's in the picture. And that's part.
I think one of the drivers for it is this, just gradual transition into these smaller scenes and more minimal images, though, because that does then expose. I mean, like you were saying earlier, you use complexity to hide flaws to a certain degree, and it's that balance, isn't it? It's a tricky balance to find, because there are certainly some scenes. If you shot a snow scene and it's just the curve of the edge of a loch or something to make a beautiful shape, and then there was just some like brown leaf on top of the snow, it would be a totally unacceptable flaw to most people. So there has to be this balance, but it's a tricky one to find.
It is, and I realise that we all probably contradict ourselves from time to time. That I've been known to remove the odd leaf here and there, and so on. But I'm a great believer in you photograph what's there, and if you don't like it, then don't photograph it, really. So I mean, just finally on that point, best example I think of all is the kind of telegraph pole conundrum, which we have a lot of in the UK. And for me, if there's telegraph poles in the picture, there are telegraph poles in the picture. That's it. You don't take them out. You could do, but you don't, because they're there. And actually, in some ways, they tell you more about the landscape, the reality of that landscape. It's so much a part of it. We have to accept it. So I just shot pictures this morning, which have got wind turbines in the far distance. Now, they're there. They don't dominate the picture, so as far as I'm concerned, they're incidental, and as incident, they work, and I've got no problem with them.
Yeah, and you're probably not party to the sort of, I don't know, if it's competition or, but social media has this funny effect, doesn't it? That I think if people start removing the imperfections, then other people start removing the imperfections, and then you get a new baseline for what perfect is, and then it needs to be more and more perfect. And I think that's the sort of gradual transition that we've seen. And it would actually be nice if people just left these flaws in and just said, I don't care about the pylons or whatever on the horizon. And then I think it would actually give photographers a lot more freedom with how they approach subjects.
Agreed.
I agree. Well, I think I've exhausted all of my questions. Did you have any more, Alex?
I think we've got through them all pretty much. It's been really interesting and great to pick your brain, Joe. I hope to do that more and more in the future, until I'm some sort of clone of your own. Till I can repeat your ideas as my own.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Joe, for coming on the show. It's been a real honor. I've been wanting to have you as a guest for a long time, and I'm really thankful to Alex to help make that happen as well.
It was my pleasure, Matt. I really enjoyed it, and thank you both for your insightful questions and for giving me a great deal more respect than I deserve, I'm sure.
No. Awesome. Well, thank you to both Joe and Alex for the amazing conversation and for finally settling the question of whether or not the United States is better than the United Kingdom. I'm joking, of course, but that was a great conversation, so thank you both. Speaking of great conversations, I'd love to have you join us on Nature Photographers Network. We engage in daily conversations to improve people's photography. I've seen a huge uptick in membership and activity there, and I'd encourage you to join as well. It's been great offering critique on your photos there and to see others interpret the landscape. I think it's a great place to level up your landscape photography. For just $49 per year, you can join in on the conversations. Just head over to npn.link/fstop and you'll be able to join us. Oh, and you can also use the code FSTOP10 for 10% off your discount. You can find all of this in the episode show notes or in the link here. We would love to see you there. Okay, well that is all for now. Thank you for your support. Thanks for stopping in, collaborating with us, and listening. See you next week.